Hello and welcome to the First and 10 podcast. I'm your host, Patrick Feltz. I'm here in Indianapolis, Indiana. I'm back on the show after a brief absence. Tommy Devine filled in for me last week. You can catch him over on the Tommy Devine podcast. Shout out to Tommy for filling in for me. It was very kind of him, and he did a great job on the show. So hopefully you listen to that episode next week. If not, we're here right now. We're bringing you all the takes from the final week of the regular season and the actual final week of the regular season. This one, I guess it's technically not, though. It's Champions Week, whatever that means. Basically, it means that the Big Ten Championship is happening, as well as a handful of other games. And here to break it all down with me is my co-host, Reid Murray. What's going on, Reid?
Not too much. Excited to get to see Ohio State football once again. Hopefully, we don't have any lingering COVID issues that will cause any problems in the near future. But once again, Ohio State, whether it's right or not, they're in Indy for a fourth straight year. So I can at least be a little bit happy about that.
Right. And before we get into this coming weekend's games, let's talk about what happened last week briefly. So first, I want to talk about the battle for the Land of Lincoln Trophy, the hat, if you will. Illinois versus Northwestern, 28-10. Northwestern Wildcats win it. They're going to the Big Ten Championship. They were already, but they still are. It's not really about what happened on the field in this game that matters to me. It's about what happened after the game. Lovie Smith is no longer the head coach of the University of Illinois. Reid, what was your first reaction to the firing of head coach Lovie Smith?
I just don't think it makes a lot of sense. Lovie Smith, he's a well-respected coach. He had success in the NFL. Now he's at Illinois, and once the program is looking like it's finally turning around, and this year you could say that they had a bad start to the year, but they've been good lately. And I mean, the fact that they contested in this game against Northwestern, they've gotten some good wins down the stretch. Illinois is looking better than they have in the last couple decades, and now you're firing the coach. It's just kind of puzzling to me. I don't know why you would do that.
Well, I think Lovie Smith should still be the coach of the Illinois Fighting Illini. Don't get me wrong. I think this is the wrong decision, at least for now. I don't think that they should have fired him because, I mean, when he took over as the head coach of Illinois, they were a terrible, terrible, terrible program. I'm not saying they're a very good program right now, but they were a train wreck. They were legitimately, I would say, the worst job in Power 5 when Lovie Smith took over. They were that bad. I would say they're even worse than Vanderbilt at that time. Lovie Smith made them at least kind of okay. They weren't just a total pushover by the end of the Lovie Smith regime. They went to a bowl game last year. They went 6-6. They beat Wisconsin. But you look at some of the other numbers of the Lovie Smith era. He won 4 games against Big Ten West opponents in his whole tenure at Illinois, which is obviously not enough. So, I mean, were there reasons to say maybe we should be achieving more than we were? Sure. But they were still doing pretty good compared to what they were just a few years before, and certainly before Lovie Smith was the head coach of Illinois. So I don't get why it's so sudden with this, especially before you played your final game of the season.
Well, and what I have to say on that is, let's look at the Vanderbilt firing of Derek Mason. Derek Mason, he's been mediocre to bad for his entire tenure at Vanderbilt. But you look at what recently happened right before his firing, you say this is the breaking point. We're winless. We went on the road to Missouri and couldn't even get in field goal range. You play an entire game against this season's Missouri Tigers and can't get in field goal range, that is a fireable offense. That is the breaking point. Here, it's the opposite. It's once things are finally starting to go in the right direction, he's gone. And I could see firing him a few years ago when the program wasn't winning games and wasn't where it needs to be. But now things are finally starting to turn around for the Illini, it seems, and they're going and firing the coach. It just doesn't make very much sense to me. Usually, it's like it's the opposite of the way you'd expect these kind of things to go.
I liked the hiring. I thought he made a lot of sense at Illinois. When he was the head coach of the Chicago Bears and the beloved head coach of the Chicago Bears. The last time the Bears were truly a winning team and a successful franchise, Lovie Smith was their head coach. They went to the Super Bowl and lost to my Colts 06-07, Super Bowl 41. Made it to another NFC championship game just a couple of years later in the 2010-2011 season against Green Bay Packers. So he was a successful coach in the NFL. He goes to college and, he was turning around a pretty terrible Illinois program. This was a program in dire straits. and he took them to a bowl game. And they weren't great this year, but that's because they played a conference-only schedule. And some of those games, like when they had all those players go down to COVID before the Purdue game and they were playing a fourth-string quarterback, they still almost beat Purdue. This could have been a 3-4 team right now with a chance at going 500 during Champions Week if they didn't have all those COVID cases against Purdue. It just doesn't make sense to me. This is a decent football team. They're not bad. I don't get why they fired him. I really think that this is the wrong move. They were moving in the right direction, and I don't know who's going to have the cachet in the state of Illinois, if you will, that Lovie Smith does, because with recruits in the state of Illinois, which is going to be their number one location to recruit no matter what, as the flagship university of the state, I don't know who's going to have the same pull as a guy who's universally beloved as the head coach of the Bears. And I think a lot of Bears fans kind of look back on those years so much more fondly than they have the last decade. And, everybody in Illinois loves the Bears, especially all these recruits. They grew up when these recruits were young, he was the coach. They remember winning and they remember him. So with that and all the Chicago area recruits having a connection to him, plus he's an African-American head coach, which unfortunately is incredibly rare in the FBS. And 3 of them were just fired: Derek Mason, Lovie Smith, Kevin Sumlin. There are, I think the number going into the season was 14, more or less, give or take, head coaches in the FBS were African-American out of 126, I believe, maybe 120, 130 ballpark. Point being, the number of black head coaches in a mostly black sport was in the teens. And the fact that we are seeing them get fired one by one is just asinine and terrible. And it shows so many deep racial problems with college football. And you can say on your helmet equality, or you can put Black Lives Matter on your helmets, or the team can send out a tweet or whatever. But the fact of the matter is African-American head coaches are not getting the same opportunities in college football. And it's just unfair and unjust, and it needs to change right now.
Yeah, you're right about that. And the 3 of them who just got fired, I would say 2 of them absolutely deserved it. But that's not to say
right.
that,
yeah, I
that
agree
what you're
with
saying
someone,
is wrong at all.
I agree with someone getting fired. He was a terrible head coach, and Derek Mason, it just wasn't working out at Vanderbilt.
Mason should have been fired 3 years ago, honestly.
Yeah, certainly. But
you're right about this trend, though. You're absolutely right with the fact that
we shouldn't be able to count on like 3 hands, like just all the black head coaches. It's insane,
especially in a sport where so many of the players.
I can't believe that in a sport with so many black players, like we were going to say, we only have this many black head coaches, and it's just wrong.
It just doesn't add up. It doesn't add up.
It's frankly racist. There's really no other way to put it. It's racist.
Yeah. And I mean, back to the point about Lovie Smith, you look at this year's team in a normal year where they don't deal with COVID and they also don't deal with a conference only schedule. This team is probably 6-6 going to a bowl game, just like they were last year. Because you look at, they're 2-5 right now. You take COVID away as a factor in that Purdue game. They probably beat Purdue. There's a win there. They probably pick up a few wins in their out of conference schedule. And I bet you they end up getting 6 wins this season. I mean, this team is trending in the right direction. And the Big Ten West this year, I think it's a fair statement to say is better than last year's Big Ten West top to bottom overall. So you're playing in a tougher Big Ten West than you were last year. Team's still doing well enough, definitely not getting worse. The firing of Lovie Smith, it's puzzling. It doesn't make sense. It's a head scratcher.
And the question is, where do you even go from here? What assistant looks at the Illinois job as a destination and not as a stepping stone? Because I think for a lot of people, a lot of the more attractive head coaching candidates, number one, either they're not going to leave their current position and they're going to wait for a more attractive spot than Illinois. Number two, they're going to go to Illinois and maybe they have some success, maybe not. Maybe they show some signs. They use it as a stepping stone. They go to a more attractive job where they're going to get paid more and get better recruits and win more games. So that's the thing with Lovie Smith is I think he viewed Illinois as a destination. He wanted to be at Illinois. Illinois was where, he was the coach of the Bears. He loves the state of Illinois. He gets it. I don't think as many coaches as I don't think there is a coach as good as Lovie Smith who wants to be at the University of Illinois.
I completely agree with you on that. Like you said, I mean, there's really not much more to say. Who wants to be the Illinois head coach?
It's a hard job.
Especially when there's other. Yeah. It is hard. It's not
some cakewalk job. I'm not saying that coaching any Power 5 football team is a cakewalk, obviously, but it's not. as easy as it is to coach at, let's say, Ohio State, which recruits itself, in all honesty. Just the name Ohio State is kind of enough for a lot of guys. But at Illinois, you can't sell Illinois the same way you can sell Ohio State or Michigan or even sell Iowa or Wisconsin, your divisional foes. It's just a hard sell, and it doesn't have the football culture or the football history or the repertoire or any of that. It's a tough job, and Lovie Smith, I think, was starting to do a really good job with it. So why you fired him is beyond me.
Yeah, I don't get it in the slightest.
I don't really have anything to say about the final end of the final game, not the final end. It's implying there's multiple ends. The final game of the Lovie Smith era, 20-10, lost to Northwestern for the hat. Not really much to say about this one. Northwestern, not too confident in them going to the Big Ten championship, but hey, they made it. That's more than you could say about last year's team. They're certainly trending upward as well, but I don't really have much to say in this game, though. Reid, do you?
This is kind of what I expected going into this game. Illinois
Certainly.
puts up a fight. Northwestern, they end up winning. They're just a stronger team overall. I would say they're, as much as I think Lovie Smith is a good coach, you can't argue that Pat Fitzgerald is a better coach. They're a better coach team with better athletes. Talent and coaching won out in this one.
Right, and Northwestern has dominated this rivalry for a while now, so I'm not surprised by this result in the slightest. So, next game I want to talk about Wisconsin and Iowa. Now, Iowa won this game 28-7, but I think this score is super misleading. And I'm not saying it's misleading because Wisconsin played well. In fact, I think it's misleading because I think Iowa played terribly. Iowa had a bad game. Wisconsin had a bad game. Neither team looked very good. There were multiple times in this game where both teams were just going back and forth, trying to hand the game to one another. I look back and I remember a possession in this game, one of the worst possessions I've seen in my entire life of watching this sport. So, botched punt for Iowa. Wisconsin gets the ball inside the 5. They fail to convert 3 consecutive plays. Then Graham Mertz throws an interception on 4th down. That is what this game was. It was Iowa doing something stupid and Wisconsin doing something even stupider. So while this was a good win for Iowa, I'm not disputing that. I'm not all too impressed by this team. I don't know about you, Reid.
I disagree. I think this game, while it was pretty ugly, I would say the fact that you could have an ugly game and beat Wisconsin does say something about your team. And that's not to say Iowa should be scratching the surface of top 10 or anything like that. But I think it's justified that they should be ranked somewhere in the middle of the pack. I think the fact that Spencer Petras actually looked good in this game, or at least looked better than we would expect from him, considering his past performances, that speaks volumes to me too. So I have more respect for Iowa after this game than I did before. And I'm not completely aligned with you on this whole anti-Iowa thing.
Iowa played terrible, though. They just did, especially in that first half. Neither team looked good. Wisconsin looked far worse, and there are a lot of things I want to talk about with Wisconsin, but Iowa didn't look particularly good, and I don't think Peters looked great, like you said. I think he looked pretty bad in the first half and kind of okay in the second half, and it was enough to win. I think Iowa did exactly what they needed to win, and yeah, they won by 21 points. That's impressive, but I'm not saying they played particularly well. It's not like they just manhandled this Wisconsin team. I would argue that Indiana had a better performance against Wisconsin despite winning by less points.
Yeah, I see what you're saying there too. And I think when the committee looked at this kind of game, if they just look at the scoreline, they see, oh, well, Indiana, they won a close one, whereas Iowa kind of put it out of reach when that's really not the case. And Iowa, final score of this game really should have been 21-7 or 21-14, quite frankly, if Graham Mertz doesn't throw a late interception. Iowa just got some garbage time points. But even then, you look at what Spencer Petras did, and you said he had a bad game. Or at the very best, an okay game. We're still talking about a guy who went up against the Wisconsin defense and got 211 yards and 2 touchdowns. That's impressive to me in and of itself.
Yeah, I'm saying he had a pretty okay second half, but the first half, nobody looked good, especially Graham Mertz, who really since that Michigan game has not looked like the player we thought he could be. And yes, he's had to go up against 3 really good defenses in Northwestern, Indiana, and Iowa. Not sure he could have had a worse draw there, but he has not been up to the task even once. And it's really concerning given his development and what we thought we could see from Mertz going forward.
Well, that's kind of what we expected. I mean, he's going up against, I would say, the three top defenses in the Big Ten. I
Well,
would
I
consider
think
maybe
it's fair
Ohio
to
State
say,
above
well,
Iowa, but
Reid. I think it's fair to say that's what we expected, but it's still disappointing because we think we would see at least something. Like maybe he would make one of those really great throws we saw against Michigan or against Illinois. I haven't seen one in the last 3 games from Graham Mertz, and it's disappointing. I would call it disappointing.
sure. But I mean, I think we're going to see some more of that Graham Mertz we saw in his first two games this week, and probably in bowl season too.
I hope so. He's a fun player to watch, but we haven't seen it the last 3 games, and that's not even once, not even for a single play. Haven't even seen a flash of it. Which I hope he proves me wrong, and I hope he pulls it back out. But I don't know. We're gonna have to see. So with that game though, and moving on to this Michigan State versus Penn State game though, this is a game that this is the weirdest game, one of the weirdest games of the season. Not the weirdest, but it's among them because Michigan State was kind of dominating this game, into early third quarter, and then you change the channel for 1 second, and suddenly Penn State is up, and uh, you wonder what happened. What happened to Michigan State? They just kind of went from dominating it to the script being absolutely flipped on them, and Penn State ended up covering.
Yeah, like you said, you flip the channel and then you see a completely different game. I was having a laugh at the fact that Penn State was down at the half, struggling with Michigan State. Um, what a bizarre result is really all you can say. Just, I mean, and I think that really shows the fact that Penn State, they had a rough start to the season, but now they got a little bit of momentum when they needed it a few weeks ago. Now they're a more motivated team, and it really comes down to the mental aspect of the game and the fact that now they have a little bit of mojo and a little bit of momentum. God, I cannot speak right now. But once they have that, they're really a different team, and it goes to show that those losses to Maryland and Iowa, I think Iowa probably would have won straight up. But I mean, the Maryland loss, it really goes to show you that was a really mentally driven loss.
Yeah, and with Penn State, they got to take care of business this week for sure. But this team's going bowling. I think if they don't win this week, then probably not. But I think this team is probably going to make a bowl game, which is crazy to think about after that 0-5 start. But here they are. This Penn State team somehow made it. They're 3-5 now. They're at least looking kind of okay. Sure, none of their wins are against super great opponents, but they're looking okay. And even if they don't make a bowl game, I could see this team uh, scheduling their own matchup, which is a thing that you can now do in the NCAA. I talked about this a couple weeks ago about how I thought that could be a cool idea. Teams basically make their own postseason games at home, road, neutral site, whatever, if they don't get into a bowl game due to all the bowl cancellations that have been happening, particularly with Big Ten and Pac-12 bowls. I think Penn State, even if they don't make a bowl game, maybe they'll schedule their own non-conference game and play another because I think that there's a lot that needs to be seen from this team still, a lot of the young guys, and they could use the experience because this is a team I think that going forward could be pretty good. And, there was a lot of talk about James Franklin getting fired when they were 0-5. That has all died down completely. It may have been a little reactionary, but nevertheless, Penn State is looking kind of okay right now, and you can lower your pitchforks, everyone.
Well, back when Penn State was winless and they were 0-4, I remember saying I still had them in my bowl predictions. And I don't think they're even going to have to make their own bowl game. I think they straight up get a bowl bid. They got a record. They're sitting at 3-5 right now. I bet you they get a win this week and go 4-5. Especially when you can factor in the fact that they are called the Penn State Indian Lions. That's a bowling record for 2020 standards. And I think they make it in without having to come up with their own Happy Valley Bowl or whatever they want to call that exhibition match. I think they get a bowl bid too. The Quick Lane Bowl isn't going to happen this year, but I think they would get the equivalent of that. God, I can't remember what the name of the Guaranteed Rate Bowl. That's the one I think they're going to get.
In Arizona.
Yeah. So I think they make their way into a regular bowl game, especially with the fact that, I mean, I guess you could say they're peaking at the right time. I mean, the right time for this team to peak really would be around the beginning of the season when they're playing Indiana and Ohio State, but they had a rough first 5 weeks. Now things are starting to turn around. I think they get into a bowl game. They face a pretty crummy opponent, and honestly might finish the season 5-5 with a bowl win.
Yeah, who would have thought? They're getting hot at just the right time, and they looked ice cold for the first half of this Michigan State game, but kind of out of nowhere they ended up pulling out and winning this game. But I thought the winner of this game, I didn't get the chance to say because I didn't get to come on the podcast, but I thought the winner of this game was going to go bowling no matter what. And I kind of think Penn State will because they're going to get Illinois. Illinois just fired their coach. Who knows what they're going to look like? Sometimes teams get a little bump after firing their coach, but who knows with the whole Lovie Smith thing and it being right before the last game of the season. I don't know if they'll get the fired your coach bump or if they're just going to kind of fizzle out and end their season. So that should be an interesting one. We're going to talk about it in a little bit. Two more games to talk about. Minnesota and Nebraska. Gophers, speaking of turnarounds, they're 500 and Nebraska falling apart. Yet another very disappointing loss for the Huskers where they couldn't pull it out despite a very close contest.
Yeah, I think one thing to notice in this game is that Minnesota, I still would rate Mohamed Ibrahim as the best player in this game, but they relied on him a lot less than they typically do. And he was hardly even getting touches until late in the first half. So I think the fact they're trying to make their offense revolve around more than just one player, and again, make this against Nebraska, and they can still get a win. That's huge moving forward. And again, I think Minnesota, they're a team who now they're 3-3, looking like they can get into a bowl game. I think they end up losing to Minnesota in this Champions Week, but even 3-4 Minnesota with the season they had last year could get into a bowl game, especially over Maryland, who has a good record but has looked rough lately and hasn't played a lot of games. I think Minnesota could get another one of those bowl bids of one of those low tier Big Ten tie-in games. And Minnesota, they're showing the right signs. I mean, the quarterback play still isn't there. Tanner Morgan is not the Tanner Morgan we saw last year. But the fact that they can actually get points on the board without giving Mohamed Ibrahim the ball every single snap, it's good for them. It's a sign of improvement.
Right. And I remember when we talked about Penn State, I mentioned the scheduling your own postseason games. Nebraska seems like the type of school to schedule their own postseason game against some terrible, terrible team and dominate them just to end the season with a moral victory. That seems like the Scott Frost move. And, I talk about Scott Frost, but speaking of terrible coaches who were at Nebraska at one point or another, Bob Diaco, the defensive coordinator at Purdue, has been fired. I thought this is a fun way to shoehorn it in since Purdue's game against Indiana has been canceled now twice. The old Oakland Bucket will not be played for the first time in over 100 years, I believe. Well, Bob Diaco's gone. Congrats, Purdue fans. I think everybody knew this was a bad hire to begin with. He was a bad defensive coordinator at Nebraska, bad head coach at UConn. He was a good defensive coordinator at Notre Dame, but that's because he had Manti Te'o, who was a Heisman candidate, and a bunch of other NFL players on that defense. So when you give him an average defense to work with, spoiler alert, they're not going to be very good. So I don't know what Purdue saw in the first place in Bob Diaco's Nebraska defense that didn't work in the Big Ten West and said, that defense that didn't work in the Big Ten West, that'll translate in the Big Ten West. So I don't know what they saw in that, but they did, and it didn't even last to the end of the season. It did last to the end of Purdue's season because they're not playing another game this year. Reid, what do you make of the Bob Diaco firing?
It makes sense. Obviously, Purdue's defense has been pretty atrocious this season. And I think moving forward, getting a better defensive coordinator to work with this D line that last year was one of the better ones in the Big Ten. This year, we haven't really seen as much that. A lot of that comes from Karlaftis being injured. But I think moving forward, this Purdue defense has potential. So getting a new defensive coordinator to sort of shake things up there, we might see a Purdue team that's more multifaceted, less of a one-dimensional Purdue team that relies too much on their offense. So I think this could be good for them moving forward. This might actually help save Jeff Brom's job if the defense can start performing next season. Purdue might start getting 8-4, 9-3 type records, and maybe the whole Brom contract situation won't seem as ridiculous as we originally thought.
Well, Bob Diaco was just a bad hire to begin with, and he was not going to make Jeff Brom look good no matter what. So, given the defense was already bad and it had bad personnel, adding a bad coordinator into the mix, that's a recipe for disaster. And it was a disaster. The Purdue defense was an objective disaster this season. So, one message from a Purdue fan, though, my friend Leo, who's been on this program before, Leo Degan, he writes, so happy. His scheme was archaic and didn't utilize the athleticism of the players at all. So, Purdue fans seem to be pretty okay with this move. And speaking of potential with this Purdue defense, you talked about George Karlaftis. The only National Signing Day thing we're going to talk about, because that was this week. We don't do a ton of recruiting during the season. That's an off-season thing for me and you. The only real recruiting thing we're going to talk about, though, is just bring up, I guess, George Karlaftis' brother, Yanni Karlaftis of West Lafayette High School, is going to Purdue, and he will be joining his brother out of the defensive line, which I think is pretty cool and will be a scary sight for every Big Ten offensive line and quarterback that they now have to deal with not only one Karlaftis, but two of them before the other one inevitably goes to the NFL. So that's a big get for Purdue, and hopefully whichever defensive coordinator they end up with can get some potential out of those two, because I think they're both going to do their thing, but maybe a good defensive coordinator will help the rest of the defense step it up. So we're going to have to see with that. Last game of the week, though, what I think ended up being the game of the week, Rutgers wins it on a game-winning kick against Maryland in overtime. Reid, is Rutgers back?
I mean, they're back to being okay, I guess.
Yeah.
It depends on what you consider back to be. Are they back to what? But sure, if you want to go ahead and call Rutgers back, I guess you can.
Rutgers is back, folks. You heard it here first. A 3-5 conference regular season with a chance in the last week of the season and Champions Week to make that 4-5. Folks, I think that could be a bowl game. And if not a bowl game, I'm going to say it for the third straight game, schedule your own, because I want to see more of this Rutgers team. This Rutgers team is actually pretty fun. Believe it or not.
I don't think Rutgers would host a bowl game, but they would totally go on the road to somebody in the ACC or something like that. I would actually love to see them face a former Big East opponent, maybe West Virginia. If West Virginia doesn't make a bowl game, depends on how their season goes. I bet they probably get a bid, but who knows? It's something fun to mess about with. But I would love to see them face some of these East Coast opponents again, whether it be in a real bowl game or in one of your own custom, I guess you call them exhibition matches at the end of the season.
It's feasible for this team to finish 500 in a year where they didn't get to play any cupcakes.
Yeah, honestly, you put them against some of these like Howard University type teams, or actually it was Maryland who played Howard last year. But regardless, you put Rutgers up against some of these teams like Monmouth. I believe Monmouth was under schedule originally in 2020. Against some of those FCS or low FBS teams, this team honestly could go from a 2-win season all the way to 6-6 in bowling. Another Illinois-esque turnaround like we saw last year. And when you look at this game, first of all, interesting that Rutgers was rotating 3 quarterbacks. This was something we were looking for going into the week with the Vedral injury. I believe he's injured and he's been ruled out for the following week. But rotating Satowski, Vedral, and Langen, how often do you see a 3 quarterback rotation in college football, and how often do you see them actually put points on the board and have it actually work effectively? I mean, this is a really interesting scheme that Schiano's going with.
Right, and with Maryland, this team kind of fell off from what we thought they were at the beginning of the season when we thought this team was maybe the third best team in the Big Ten East, but they still made a lot of steps in the right direction this year for Maryland, and I think COVID got to them more than it got to just about any team in the whole league. They did end up only playing 5 games. So while that sucks for them, they only had to play 5 games. 2-3 is a little disappointing, but hey, I mean, a lot of people expected less of them, and COVID messed with their flow, and they missed players for games, and there's the whole thing. Whereas I think in a regular year, this team probably would have gone 6-6 and went to a bowl game.
Yeah, and I'm going to ask you maybe the hardest question of the year right now. How would you rank each team in the Big Ten East? If you had to give a 1-7 ranking of the Big Ten East, obviously the top 2 are pretty easy, Ohio State and Indiana. How do you rate the rest of those 5 teams in comparison to one another.
In what regard would I rank them? As in
just overall best
now?
team.
Like in general?
Yeah, just
like right
which
now?
team is the best? Like power rankings, essentially.
Give me your power rankings for the 2020 season, or just like going forward. There's so many ways to cover this.
This season, the 2020 season.
Okay.
Your Big Ten East power rankings.
Ohio State, Indiana, Penn State, Rutgers, Michigan, Maryland, Michigan State. But those last 4 are very, 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 very tough.
Interesting, yeah. I would also have to put Penn State at number 3. Who would have thought we'd be saying that 3 or 4 weeks ago? Honestly, those last 4 are so hard because they've all really beaten one another up. And Michigan State, when you look at resume only, they beat Michigan. They got a win against Northwestern. That's probably the best win out of all those teams. But you really could say they're the worst team there, and that those wins really came out of a fluke situation. Rutgers is another team who I would say is so hard to rate because on one hand, I mean, they got the win against Maryland. They got the Purdue win. They really should have beaten Michigan. They've had some good games, but there's just something about Rutgers that says they shouldn't be there. I still would probably put Rutgers at 4th, as shocking as that is to say. But honestly, what Maryland has shown me in the last few weeks is that they might actually be the 2nd worst team in the East, depending on where you put each team. But yeah, interesting to think about how you would rate these 7 Big Ten East teams. Much harder.
That changes
than the West,
every single week.
It really does.
Changes every single
with
week.
Each result.
Yeah, that's so tough.
And I think if we were to rate them right now and have one finalized list, it'd be different in a few days whenever these Saturday games are over.
Right, absolutely. Let's get into those Saturday games and one Friday game. Champions Week. It was originally supposed to be number 1 versus number 2, number 1 versus number 1, number 2 versus number 2, so on and so on. Big Ten East versus Big Ten West. That did not happen. It was basically just let's reschedule some games and kind of make the matchups we feel like.
Yeah, and I think that makes sense. I think it makes a lot of sense to have 1 week where you have the Big Ten championship and then you have makeup games. But the problem is just, in the beginning of the season, the Big Ten said it was going to be the 2 versus 2 or 3 versus 3 thing. And it just doesn't make sense why they made this rule, just like the rule about the minimum games to make the championship game, why they made all these rules early in the season when they really didn't mean anything. They might as well have just said, look, we're going to have this other week. We have the Big Ten championship going on, and then we're going to have other games take place in the Big Ten conference. It just doesn't make sense why they made these rules and why they set these expectations when, 2020 is a year you really can't. It's hard to schedule things and it's hard to anticipate what's going to happen months in advance. So it's just bizarre why the Big Ten did this in the first place when, you're going to end up having, you got Wisconsin, Minnesota going to be made up. You got Michigan and Iowa we're going to play. Just some of these matchups that are not at all the essentially second tier version of the Big Ten championship. Those games happening, it just doesn't make sense to me.
The 2nd through 7th tier versions of the Big Ten championship. And I thought it was a great idea when it first got announced, and I guess we're never going to get to really see it happen. I think it's something they should do every year. I think they should keep this going. I think they should give it a chance in a non-COVID year because I think it would be really, really, really cool. So maybe they do it at some point. I don't know. It would bring some more interesting matchups, but we're not going to see it this year, really, although kind of. But 2 games we are not going to see for sure, though. Michigan and Iowa, Indiana and Purdue, both of those are canceled due to COVID. Michigan season is over. Purdue season is over. Indiana and Iowa, they're going bowling. We will see them in bowl season. Presumably, assuming COVID clears up at Indiana.
Yeah. It really sucks that these games get canceled, but I get the feeling that the reason some of these games were scheduled in the first place, like the Old Oaken Bucket makeup or the Iowa-Michigan game, the reason they didn't just say Iowa-Indiana is because I had the feeling that they knew some of these games were going to take place. I had the feeling that they knew, considering Indiana and Purdue's COVID cases, that neither of the teams would be playing. So they said, you know what, let's put them up against one another. And it'll look like we tried to make this rivalry game happen. So unfortunately, those aren't going to get to take place. But it seems like this was kind of a planned thing to Big Ten. They knew it was unlikely that Indiana Michigan, Purdue were going to be able to play football games. So that's why they scheduled them the way they did.
One thing I missed earlier today, apparently, Michigan State and Maryland's been canceled. So now we're only going to have 4 games this weekend in the Big Ten, which that is disappointing that only 4 of the 7 games are even getting played. But one that is getting played is the conference championship. And we will get to that last. I think that's going to be kind of our cap of the episode because it's the best one, the most important one. Anyway, let's get into our first game of the week. Nebraska and Rutgers. I would call this the Noah Vedral revenge game, but Noah Vedral is not playing. He is hurt. Nebraska is a 6.5-point favorite. I hate that line. I think Rutgers is going to win this game. I think Rutgers wins this game. Friday night in Piscataway. A little bit weird. Little fluky kind of game. I think Nebraska is unprepared. Nebraska is playing terribly. They're playing uninspired football. Rutgers has heart. Nebraska doesn't. That's the difference between these teams. If Noah Vedral were playing, I think Rutgers would win definitely. Not as sure without him. I still think Rutgers is going to win this game, though. I'm taking the Scarlet Knights 27-24.
Now, in this game, I think the Cornhuskers are a lock to play in their own custom bowl game or their own custom postseason exhibition, whatever you want to call that. But it's still possible for them to make an actual bowl game. There's still a prayer. It's still within the realm of possibility, you can say. So I think this is a Nebraska team who, Scott Frost wants to make a bowl game. It's not looking like he's going to get fired, but he still wants to extend his tenure at Nebraska as long as possible. He wants to make the best case for himself. So it would be huge for him to get a win in this game and potentially make a bowl game, potentially win a bowl game. So Nebraska fighting for their bowl chances. And I just think at the end of the day, Rutgers, especially a Rutgers team without Vedral, I think they rely on Vedral too much. I think going up against a team in Nebraska that just has better athletes, and you can argue about how well coached they are or how fine-tuned they are, what kind of football they're playing. The athletes are better, and I think when Nebraska, I think they're going to be inspired in this game. Playing a Nebraska team who's actually fighting for something, I think is going to be a difficult test for Rutgers. I have Nebraska winning this one 28-21.
I think it'll be close regardless, though, Reid. I do think this is going to be a close ball game, so we're going to have to see. Next game, the 4 o'clock Saturday game. They brought back the Axe game that was originally canceled, folks. We've got an actual rivalry the last week of the season. Minnesota, Wisconsin, battle for the Axe. Wisconsin's a 12.5-point favorite. I hate that line. I'm not even sure Wisconsin's going to win this game. These teams do have equivalent records. Obviously, Wisconsin's had a whole lot more hype this season, but Wisconsin's on a 3-game losing streak. Or I did say they had equivalent records. They have equivalent amount of losses. Minnesota's actually got more wins than Wisconsin. Minnesota is 3-3. Wisconsin's 2-3. Wisconsin's obviously played less games due to COVID, but I don't get how Wisconsin is such a big favorite here. That makes zero sense to me because Minnesota's been playing pretty okay recently, and Wisconsin's been playing terrible. I don't know if Wisconsin can even win this game. I kind of like Minnesota here.
Yeah, I would say Wisconsin is the favorite in this one because they're just the better team. But I actually agree with you. I think Minnesota could totally sneak out a win here in this game. They're peaking at the right time, and with the rest of the team, like we said last week, they relied less on Ibrahim. They showed they can still get it done against Nebraska. If Ibrahim has a big game here, Minnesota definitely keeps it close, could potentially get a win. And I think that would lead to a really misleading view of Wisconsin when you look at their record. Honestly, they could actually miss a bowl game if they lose this one, as bizarre as that is. They were such a good team early in the season. I think that would lead to one of the more misleading records we've ever seen. And I would think you would probably say they're the best 333 team in college football history. Because this Wisconsin team is good. You got to say
we'll have to look at the numbers on that one.
Yeah, there would have to be some kind of research on it, but I can't imagine finding a team with a winning percentage of 333 better than this Wisconsin team if they do end up going 2-4. So as weird as it is, Wisconsin totally could lose this one. But we've seen the way Mertz can shine against poor defenses. I think going up against Minnesota, this is just the bounce back he needs. I think this offense puts a lot of points on the board. I have Wisconsin in a 45-31 win.
Reid, I don't know about that. I think that It's a game of momentum, is what I've learned. Wisconsin's riding a 3-game losing streak, and they've lost all their confidence. However, Wisconsin at the same time is playing for something. They're playing for bowl eligibility. If they lose this game and go 2-4, they probably aren't making a bowl game. So they've got a lot to play for, let alone they're playing against their arch rivals. They're playing for a trophy, and so is Minnesota. I think Minnesota's going to go bowling no matter what. Wisconsin, if they lose this game, 2-4 is a tough sell for a bowl game. So I like Wisconsin in a very, very, very close one. I like it 21-20 Wisconsin. I think this one could go either way, but I think Minnesota definitely covers though.
Yeah, I could see them covering. I think at the end, I think Wisconsin runs up the score. And I just think Mertz against the defense that's going to allow him to be the Graham Mertz we saw earlier in the year. I think Wisconsin's got to win this one.
And that game, I am sure, will have just great television ratings because there is no game better than the Axe at 4:00. Particularly, there is not a game between two college football playoff locks playing in Charlotte, North Carolina, being the Clemson Tigers and Notre Dame Fighting Irish. If that game were happening, then maybe, but I don't think there's a game between those two teams at that exact same time. So I'm sure everybody in the nation will be locked in on BTN watching the battle for the Axe.
Yeah, and it's funny that you called Clemson a playoff lock there. I would say if they lose this game, unless they lose in overtime by 3 points, I think Clemson actually could end up missing the playoff. I would say Notre Dame's a playoff lock. But that's enough playoff
Clemson,
talk for now.
I think the committee's going to do whatever they can to get Clemson in there.
That's fair. I think if Clemson loses this game by 2 possessions, they're out. I think by 1 possession,
I don't see that happening though. Anyway, let's not talk about that game that isn't happening at 4:00 on ABC at the exact same time as the battle for the Axe, and that nobody will be watching instead of Minnesota versus Wisconsin. I can promise you that much. How about another game that nobody's going to be watching that does not start in between the ACC championship game between not Clemson and not Notre Dame, and not the SEC championship game between not Florida and not Alabama, and that is Penn State versus Illinois. Penn State is a 15.5-point favorite over the coachless Illinois Fighting Illini. Reid, I don't even think it's going to be that close. I like Penn State in an absolute blowout here. This team is on fire.
Yeah, and when you consider the fact that Illinois has lost their head coach, especially coach, I imagine all these players loved him. I don't see this Illinois team being too inspired, and I see the opposite happening in Penn State. I think they'll get a bowl game, but I think that they still are kind of fighting for their bowl eligibility. It's possible they don't make one. So they're fighting for something. They've got something to play for, and they're hitting their stride late in the season at the right time. I have Penn State, not Purdue. Definitely not Purdue. By a score of, let's say, 27-14.
I like it here. Penn State 35, Illinois 20. So that'll do it for this week. 35-20. Now I'm thinking about it. No, I'm going 35-14 Penn State. That's too close. I think Penn State's going to cover that spread. That'll do it for this week's recap and preview. We did both. One of the shortest previews ever, only 4 games due to 3 COVID cancellations. That is very disappointing. I would love to see more Big Ten football, but what are you going to do? Sometimes the virus just gets in the way, and that sucks. But speaking of things that we're going to be previewing or recapping, I guess, you might be curious to our YouTube viewers why I'm wearing this North Dakota State sweatshirt. And to our regular podcast listeners, you are not curious at all because you can't see me. But if you could see me and you go to our YouTube channel, you can search up First and 1G over on youtube.com. You would see this North Dakota State Bison sweatshirt I'm wearing from Home Field Apparel. In the spring, when the FCS plays football, we will be covering it. We will be doing Missouri Valley Mondays, where every Monday after Missouri Valley football, which is kind of the Big Ten's FCS sister conference, if you will, it's the big Midwestern conference. We will be talking about the Missouri Valley. So you will see that. We'll talk about that. North Dakota State's the big team there. However, we've got one more game to talk about that I completely forgot about because I was only thinking regular season games. We have a conference championship game, and I'm an absolute idiot, and Reid Murray is laughing at me right now. If you could see his Zoom screen, I forgot about the conference championship game. Northwestern, Ohio State.
I was wondering if this was part of your big buildup.
I was too excited.
You were too excited. Yeah.
I was too excited to talk about the Missouri Valley to talk about Northwestern versus Ohio State. Because
when you compare to the powerhouse conference of the Missouri Valley, who cares?
Hey, listen, Reid. Listen, Reid Murray. If you were, you know what this Northwestern versus Ohio State game is going to remind me of? This is like North Dakota State in 2019, you know, the best team in the country. This is like North Dakota State against Illinois State, in all honesty. That's a Missouri Valley moment for you right there. And that game was a blowout, if my recollection serves me correctly. That is a Missouri Valley moment, and Northwestern might have to be relegated to the Missouri Valley if they lose this game by as much as I think they will, because I think Ohio State is playing angry, and I think Ohio State is going to kick the doors off of Northwestern. And I think Northwestern is a decent team, but Ohio State is going to just crush them because they can't expose them the way that it takes to expose Ohio State. If you want to expose Ohio State, it's all about vertical passing and getting the ball down the field and making big plays. Northwestern's not a big play offense. They don't stand a chance. I like Ohio State here, 49-14.
Yeah, I actually disagree with you on that. I think you're absolutely right about the fact that Northwestern won't be able to pull away a win because they just don't have the explosiveness that Indiana does. And Indiana almost got there. They almost came out of Columbus with a win against Ohio State. But Northwestern seems to be the Indiana Hoosiers minus the sort of electric component of that team. So they don't have what it takes to pull off a win. And I think the only way the Northwestern does get a win is if the run game for Ohio State is just completely stagnant. Because in this game, Ohio State, obviously, they can win games without running the ball super effectively. But the thing is, well, there's rumors about Chris Olave being out with COVID. Even then, they could still completely put up ridiculous numbers with just Garrett Wilson and the other incredible receivers in this receiving core. However, you put them up against this Northwestern secondary, a secondary similar to that of Indiana. Ohio State, although they put up a lot of points and a lot of yards against Indiana, their offense still struggled to an extent in that game. And the fact that the passing game wasn't perfect then, they had to go rely on the run game. So it's really going to come down to whether or not Teague and Sermon are going to be on top of the game. I think they will be, and I don't think Northwestern poses too much of a challenge. But if the run game can't get going and if Fields isn't able to run the ball, I think that could lead to an Ohio State loss. Other than that, I think there's no way that it's an Ohio State loss is possible, and they pass the ball too well. Well, actually, there's one way Justin Fields gets injured. I think if he is injured, God, I'm going to have to knock on wood that doesn't happen. Then we're talking about a completely different game, but a completely healthy Ohio State cannot lose in this one. However, I think Northwestern keeps it somewhat close, and I think the scoreline of this game is going to be similar to the Big Ten Championship of 2018 between these two same teams, and I'm actually predicting the exact same score in that game as there was in that game. 45-24 Ohio State is my final score prediction. I think Peyton Ramsey looks okay in this game, like he has all season, and that's going to be enough to get Northwestern a few touchdowns and a few decent drives, just not enough to beat Ohio State. I think they ought to look good. They ought to make Ohio State not look incredible, but they just don't have what it takes to actually become Big Ten champions this year.
And as far as bowl games go for Northwestern, kind of thinking Citrus Bowl after this one. Citrus, maybe Outback.
Honestly, with the way the committee looks at Iowa, they might put Iowa in the Citrus and Northwestern in the Outback, as unfortunate as that is. Northwestern this season totally deserves the Citrus bid. They seem like the quintessential Big Ten Citrus Bowl team, but considering the way that the committee has evaluated teams this season, you really can't imagine that they're going to give them a fair rating and put them in a fair bowl game.
Yeah, and that's tough. You'll get the head-to-head. Northwestern won head-to-head by a point, but they won. And then you look at who did they lose to? Well, Iowa lost twice and Northwestern lost twice, but the difference is Northwestern's losses came later in the season, and the committee has always had a recency bias, and that's just the way it is. And they also have a bias towards Iowa because of their athletic director being the head of it. But that's neither here nor there. Anyway, I think that will actually do it for our show this time. Thank you so much for listening to the First and 10. We appreciate it. Have a good one. We'll see you next time. Bye.